Most people believe they are afraid of pain. They are not. Pain, by itself, is direct. It arrives, it is felt, and it passes. Fear is different. Fear lingers. Fear multiplies. Fear survives long after the moment has ended. The mind is not frightened by pain itself. It is frightened by what pain represents. Pain represents disruption. Loss represents instability. Change represents the collapse of assumptions. This is why two people can experience the same event and suffer very differently. One feels pain and moves on. The other feels fear and collapses inward. The difference is not strength. It is not resilience. It is not intelligence. The difference is expectation. The mind fears change because it has built its entire sense of safety on the idea that life should remain consistent. Consistency feels survivable. Predictability feels protective. Repetition feels reliable. From an early age, the mind learns to associate safety with what repeats. The familiar home, the familiar faces, the familiar routines. This conditioning is not wrong. It is natural, but the mind quietly extends this logic too far. It begins to assume that what feels familiar should remain, that what has lasted so far deserves to last longer. That continuity is something life owes in exchange for effort. This is where fear takes root. The mind does not simply observe stability. It demands it, and when that demand is challenged, fear appears, not because something terrible is happening, but because something unexpected is happening. Fear is not the response to danger. It is the response to violated expectation. This is why fear often arrives before thought. Your chest tightens. Your breathing changes. Your body contracts. Only afterward does the story appear. What if this goes wrong? What if I lose this? What if I can't recover? These thoughts are not the cause of fear. They are the mind's attempt to explain it. The body senses instability before the mind understands it. And instability feels threatening because the mind equates stability with survival. But this equation is false. Stability has never guaranteed survival. It has only created comfort. Impermanence has always been present. Your body has always been changing. Your circumstances have always been shifting. Your identity has always been evolving. Yet the mind reacts as if change were an intrusion. Why? Because the mind has confused structure with safety. It believes that if things are structured, they are secure. If roles are defined, they are reliable. If plans are detailed, they are protective. Impermanence exposes the weakness of this belief. No structure survives forever. No role remains unchanged. No plan controls reality. When this becomes undeniable, fear emerges. Not because the situation is unbearable, but because the illusion of control is collapsing. The mind fears change because change reveals how little control it ever had. This realization is deeply unsettling. It threatens the narrative that says, if I do the right things, life will cooperate. Impermanence does not cooperate. It does not resist either. It simply moves. The Buddha understood this with extraordinary clarity. He did not say that suffering comes from pain. He said suffering comes from clinging. Clinging is the refusal to accept movement. It is the attempt to hold what is already passing, to freeze what is already changing, to secure what was never meant to be secured. The mind clings because it believes clinging prevents loss. In reality, clinging creates fear. When you cling to a relationship, you fear its ending. When you cling to an identity, you fear its collapse. When you cling to certainty, you fear uncertainty. Fear does not protect what you love. It punishes you for loving it as if it were permanent. This is one of the most painful misunderstandings of human life. You are taught to believe that fear is the price of caring, that anxiety is evidence of commitment, That worry means you're responsible. But fear is not proof of care. It is proof of attachment to outcome. You can care deeply without fear. You can love fully without clinging, but only if you accept impermanence. Without that acceptance, love becomes fragile. It demands reassurance. It seeks guarantees. It reacts violently to change. This is why fear often hides inside love. You say you're afraid because you care. But what you're really afraid of is losing the sense of safety you attached to what you love. The mind turns connection into dependency, and dependency cannot tolerate impermanence. This dynamic appears everywhere in modern life. People fear losing jobs not only because of money, but because work provides identity, structure, and meaning. People fear aging not only because of the body, but because youth represents relevance and possibility. People fear endings not only because of grief, but because endings expose the fact that nothing was guaranteed. Impermanence threatens every story the mind uses to feel secure, so the mind reacts defensively. It plans obsessively, it controls aggressively, it worries endlessly. These behaviors look productive, but they are driven by fear. The mind believes that if it stays vigilant enough, impermanence will be delayed or softened. This is another illusion. Vigilance does not stop change. It only exhausts you before change arrives. Fear drains energy because it fights what cannot be fought. Impermanence does not respond to resistance. It does not slow down. It does not explain itself. The more the mind resists, the more tense it becomes. This tension is what you experience as fear. The tragedy is that fear feels necessary. The mind believes fear keeps it alert, prepared, and safe. But fear does not increase clarity. It narrows perception. It pulls attention away from what is happening now and projects it into imagined futures. These futures are rarely accurate. They are shaped by attachment, not reality. Fear asks, "What if this ends?" Impermanence replies, "Everything ends." Fear asks, "What will happen to me?" Impermanence does not answer, and in that silence, the mind panics. But silence is not danger. Silence is honesty. Impermanence does not tell you how to feel. It does not instruct you how to respond. It simply reveals the truth. Nothing is stable enough to be depended on for safety. This does not mean life is hostile. It means safety was misunderstood. Safety does not come from stability. It comes from adaptability, the ability to respond, not the guarantee that nothing will change. When this is seen clearly, fear begins to loosen. You stop asking life to remain predictable. You stop interpreting change as threat. You stop demanding certainty before acting. Fear weakens because its foundation collapses. The mind no longer believes stability is required for survival. This realization does not make you reckless. It makes you present. You stop living ahead of life and start living inside it. Change still happens. Loss still hurts. But fear no longer dominates, because you are no longer asking reality to be something it has never been. Impermanence does not frighten the mind at first. What frightens the mind is meaning. Change becomes terrifying only after the mind assigns ownership to what is changing. Before that moment, impermanence is simply movement. After that moment, it becomes loss. This is the quiet transformation that turns reality into threat. The mind does not experience impermanence directly. It filters it through identity. It says, "This is happening to me. This affects my future. This threatens my safety." Without this filter, change would still occur, but fear would not follow. Personalization is the mechanism that converts impermanence into suffering. The mind begins this process early in life. As a child, you experience constant change with little fear. Friends come and go. Places shift. Routines dissolve. But as identity forms, something else forms alongside it. Ownership. You're no longer just experiencing life. You're invested in it. You are taught to say, my body, my family, my success, my future. Language itself reinforces possession. At first, this feels empowering. Ownership creates a sense of control. Control creates the illusion of safety. But impermanence never recognizes ownership. It does not care what you call yours. This is where fear begins to deepen. When the mind identifies with a role, impermanence threatens identity. When the mind identifies with a relationship, impermanence threatens belonging. When the mind identifies with a future, impermanence threatens purpose. Fear is born not from change, but from the possibility of losing oneself. This is why fear feels existential. You are not simply afraid that something will end. You are afraid of who you will be when it does. The mind quietly asks, if this changes, who am I? Impermanence does not answer, and the lack of answer feels dangerous. To compensate, the mind builds stories. It imagines futures where loss leads to collapse, where endings lead to emptiness, where uncertainty leads to irrelevance. These stories are not predictions. They are defenses. Fear is the mind rehearsing disaster in an attempt to avoid it. But impermanence does not respond to rehearsal. No amount of anticipation prevents change. No amount of anxiety softens endings. The mind believes fear prepares it. In reality, fear only exhausts it. The personalization of impermanence also distorts time. The mind pulls future change into the present and reacts to it as if it were already happening. You suffer losses that have not occurred. You grieve endings that have not arrived. Impermanence becomes a constant background threat. This is how anxiety becomes chronic. The mind lives ahead of life, scanning for signs of instability. It becomes hypervigilant. Hypervigilance looks like responsibility. It looks like foresight. It looks like intelligence. But it is fear in disguise. The Buddha described this state as suffering created by clinging to self. Not the self as personality, but the self as ownership. The idea that there is a core me that must be protected from change. Impermanence threatens this idea relentlessly. Because if everything changes, what exactly is being protected? This question destabilizes the mind. So it avoids the question. Instead, it doubles down on control. It tries to manage impermanence by narrowing life, by reducing risk, by avoiding exposure. But avoidance does not remove impermanence. It only shrinks experience. Fear makes life smaller. It convinces you to trade vitality for safety, to trade openness for predictability, to trade presence for protection. This trade never works, because impermanence does not negotiate. The mind eventually discovers that no amount of caution prevents change. And when that discovery arrives suddenly, fear intensifies. This is why fear spikes during transitions, illness, breakups, aging, failure, loss. These moments strip away the illusion that identity was stable. The mind panics not because change is unbearable, but because its reference points have dissolved. Impermanence reveals that identity was provisional. This revelation can be terrifying or liberating. Fear chooses terror. Understanding chooses freedom. The difference lies in whether the mind continues to personalize impermanence. When impermanence is seen impersonally, fear loses its narrative. Change is no longer happening to me. It is happening. Loss is no longer taking something from me. It is ending a form. Uncertainty is no longer a threat. It is a condition. This shift does not erase emotion. It changes relationship to emotion. Sadness can exist without panic. Grief can exist without collapse. Endings can exist without identity loss. The mind no longer treats change as evidence of danger. This is where fear weakens. Fear requires a story of personal threat. When that story dissolves, fear has nothing to sustain it. Impermanence continues exactly as before. What changes is the interpretation. The Buddha did not ask people to deny loss. He asked them to stop misinterpreting it. Loss does not mean life has failed you. It means life has moved. When the mind stops demanding that life protect identity, identity loosens. And when identity loosens, fear fades, not because life becomes safe, but because safety was never found in ownership. Safety emerges from adaptability, from the ability to meet change without self-collapse. Impermanence does not threaten this ability. It develops it. Every ending you survive without clinging strengthens this capacity. Every change you face without personalization weakens fear. Over time, something shifts. The mind no longer treats impermanence as an attack. It recognizes it as the ground of experience. Fear loses its urgency, not because nothing matters, but because nothing needs to be defended as permanent. This is not detachment from life. It is intimacy without possession, and fear cannot survive there. The mind does not accept impermanence passively. When it realizes that things change, it does not relax. It reacts. That reaction is control. Control is the mind's primary strategy for dealing with impermanence. It appears logical, responsible, even wise. But beneath its surface, control is fear attempting to disguise itself as competence. The mind believes that if it can manage outcomes, impermanence will become tolerable. If it can plan far enough ahead, uncertainty will lose its edge. If it can secure enough resources, relationships, or knowledge, change will become survivable. This belief is deeply ingrained. You are taught that preparation equals safety, that planning equals intelligence, that control equals maturity. And in limited ways, this is true. Planning has value. Structure has function. Coordination allows societies to exist. But the mind quietly extends this logic beyond its limits. It begins to believe that everything can be managed, that impermanence can be negotiated, that if enough effort is applied, life will stabilize. This is where fear intensifies, because impermanence does not cooperate with control. No matter how carefully you plan, things change. No matter how responsibly you act, outcomes shift. No matter how much you secure, loss still arrives. The mind experiences this as betrayal. It says, "I did everything right. I prepared. I followed the rules." Impermanence does not respond, and this silence feels intolerable. Fear grows stronger when control fails, because the mind has invested its sense of safety in the strategy of control itself. When control collapses, the mind feels exposed. This is why people who appear the most in control often experience the most intense fear when change arrives. Their stability was conditional, maintained, dependent on predictability. Impermanence dismantles what is conditional. Control creates a fragile form of safety. It works only as long as reality behaves as expected. Fear thrives in this fragility. The mind becomes hyper-focused on maintaining order. It monitors every deviation. It reacts aggressively to uncertainty. This constant vigilance is exhausting, yet the mind believes it is necessary. Fear convinces the mind that relaxing control will invite disaster, that surrender equals collapse, that letting go means giving up. This misunderstanding is profound. Surrender is not the absence of action. It is the absence of illusion. Surrender does not mean you stop planning. It means you stop believing that plans can guarantee permanence. Surrender does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop demanding that what you care about remain unchanged. The mind resists surrender because surrender threatens identity. If control is released, who are you? The mind has learned to define itself as the manager of life, the protector, the decision-maker. Impermanence exposes the limits of this role. It reveals that life was never under management. This realization destabilizes the ego. Fear appears as the ego's defense against being rendered unnecessary. The ego says, "If I am not in control, I am nothing." Impermanence quietly contradicts this. Life continues without permission. Change unfolds without consultation. Meaning arises without control. The mind cannot tolerate this easily, so it tightens, it micromanages, it overthinks, it rehearses worst-case scenarios. This is why fear often masquerades as productivity. You worry and call it responsibility. You obsess and call it preparation. You ruminate and call it foresight. But fear does not improve outcomes. It only narrows awareness. Under fear, the mind sees fewer options. It becomes rigid. It reacts rather than responds. Impermanence does not require reaction. It requires adaptability. Adaptability is not control. It is responsiveness without resistance. When control dominates, adaptability collapses. The mind becomes brittle. This brittleness is what breaks under pressure. The Buddha understood that clinging to control is a subtle form of attachment. Not attachment to objects, but attachment to authority over outcomes. The desire to be in charge of life's direction. Impermanence removes this authority, and fear arises in response. Fear is the mind's protest against losing command. But command was never real. The mind confuses influence with control. You can influence conditions. You cannot command them. Impermanence clarifies this distinction brutally. Once seen, control begins to loosen, not because the mind becomes passive, but because it becomes honest. You still act. You still choose. You still engage. But you stop demanding certainty. You stop asking effort to guarantee results. This changes the quality of action. Action becomes grounded rather than frantic, intentional rather than compulsive, present rather than future obsessed. Fear weakens because its primary fuel is gone. The belief that everything depends on your ability to control outcomes. When that belief dissolves, fear loses leverage. You realize that impermanence has always been present, even when life felt stable. Stability was never the absence of change. It was merely a slow rate of change. Control thrived when change was gradual. Fear exploded when change accelerated. But impermanence was always there. Seeing this removes the personal drama. Life is not attacking you. It is unfolding. Control is not being taken away. It was never truly there. This recognition does not make life easy. It makes it workable. You stop wasting energy trying to dominate what cannot be dominated. That energy returns as clarity. Clarity does not promise safety. It offers alignment. You align with movement rather than resist it. Fear diminishes because resistance ends. The mind no longer feels responsible for holding reality together. It becomes free to experience life directly. Impermanence stops being the enemy of peace. It becomes the condition that allows peace to exist without illusion. And fear, deprived of its justifications, begins to fade. Fear does not end when impermanence is understood intellectually. Understanding is only the doorway. Fear begins to dissolve when resistance ends. Most people believe acceptance means liking what happens. It does not. Acceptance means seeing what happens without demanding that it be different. This distinction is crucial. The mind resists impermanence not because change is unbearable, but because resistance has become habitual. It reacts automatically. It tightens. It argues. Acceptance interrupts this pattern. When impermanence is accepted, something subtle but profound occurs. The mind stops fighting movement. This does not make life passive. It makes it fluid. Resistance creates friction. Friction creates fear. Acceptance removes friction. You still experience change. You still experience loss. You still experience uncertainty. But these experiences no longer collide with the belief that they should not exist. That collision was the source of fear. Fear thrives on internal conflict. The conflict between what is happening and what the mind believes should be happening. Acceptance resolves that conflict. This is why acceptance feels relieving even when circumstances remain difficult. Nothing external may change, but internally the war ends. The Buddha did not teach acceptance as a moral instruction. He taught it as a consequence of seeing clearly. When you see that everything changes, resistance becomes illogical. You stop asking impermanence to justify itself. You stop asking life for explanations. You stop asking time to slow down. Acceptance does not mean you approve of loss. It means you recognize that loss is not optional. This recognition transforms fear. Fear is fueled by the belief that something has gone wrong. Acceptance reveals that nothing has gone wrong. Something has simply ended. The mind often confuses acceptance with surrender to defeat. But acceptance is not defeat. Defeat implies an opponent. Impermanence is not an opponent. It is the environment in which all experience unfolds. When you stop treating impermanence as an enemy, fear loses its narrative. Fear says, "This should not be happening." Acceptance replies, "This is happening." That reply is not emotional. It is factual. And facts are grounding. Fear floats on imagined futures and alternate realities. Acceptance anchors the mind in what is actually occurring. This anchoring stabilizes awareness. You no longer feel pulled apart by competing timelines. You're not living in the past, resenting what ended. You're not living in the future, fearing what might happen. You are present. Presence does not eliminate pain. It prevents panic. Pain exists in the body. Fear exists in the mind's refusal to stay. Acceptance keeps the mind here. This is why fear weakens. Without resistance, fear has nothing to push against. Acceptance also changes how identity is experienced. When impermanence is resisted, identity is rigid. You define yourself by roles, achievements, relationships, and narratives. When those change, identity fractures. Fear rushes in to protect what remains. But when impermanence is accepted, identity loosens. You no longer experience yourself as a fixed object moving through time. You experience yourself as awareness moving with time. This shift is subtle but decisive. Awareness is not threatened by change. It witnesses change. When identity moves from object to awareness, fear loses its target. You are no longer defending a static version of yourself. You allow yourself to evolve. Acceptance also alters how effort is experienced. Under fear, effort is desperate. You try to secure outcomes. You try to prevent endings. You try to control uncertainty. Effort becomes exhausting because it is misdirected. Acceptance redirects effort. You still act. You still choose. You still engage. But you stop asking effort to guarantee permanence. You act because action is appropriate now, not because it promises a fixed future. This creates a calmer intensity. You do not rush. You do not freeze. You respond. Response is different from reaction. Reaction is driven by fear. Response is guided by clarity. Acceptance creates space for response. In that space, fear cannot dominate. Another transformation occurs in emotional life. Without acceptance, emotions are treated as threats. Sadness must be avoided. Grief must be suppressed. Uncertainty must be resolved immediately. Fear grows stronger because emotions are resisted. Acceptance allows emotions to move. Sadness is felt without panic. Grief is experienced without collapse. Uncertainty is tolerated without urgency. Emotions pass more quickly when they are not opposed. Fear, which thrives on suppression and avoidance, weakens. Acceptance does not numb you. It sensitizes you accurately. You feel what is present rather than what fear predicts. This accuracy is stabilizing. Fear exaggerates. Acceptance clarifies. Acceptance also restores trust. Not trust that things will go well, but trust that you can meet what arrives without losing yourself. This trust is not confidence. It is resilience. Resilience does not come from controlling life. It comes from adapting to life. Impermanence trains resilience when it is accepted. Each change faced without resistance strengthens adaptability. Each ending met without identity collapse reduces fear. Over time, acceptance becomes embodied. You no longer need to remind yourself that things change. You live that understanding. Fear does not disappear completely, but it no longer governs. It becomes a signal rather than a ruler. You notice fear when resistance begins to return, and you release it sooner. Acceptance is not a final achievement. It is an ongoing orientation. You accept again and again. Each acceptance loosens fear further. Eventually, fear loses its authority. It no longer dictates choices. It no longer defines meaning. It no longer frames reality as threat. Impermanence becomes familiar, not comforting, not pleasant, but honest. And honesty is calming. When resistance ends, fear has nowhere to stand. What remains is clarity, presence, and the quiet strength to move with what is. When fear loosens, something unfamiliar appears. Space. Not empty space, but living space. The space where life is no longer negotiated. Most people live as if life were a contract. If I do this, then this should happen. If I behave correctly, then things should hold. If I prepare enough, then I should be safe. Impermanence violates every clause of this imagined agreement. When fear dominates, this violation feels intolerable. When fear weakens, the agreement itself is questioned. You begin to see that life never promised guarantees. This realization is not depressing. It is liberating. Living without guarantees does not mean living recklessly. It means living honestly. You stop waiting for certainty before committing to experience. You stop postponing presence until outcomes are secured. You act because action is appropriate now, not because it ensures permanence. This changes the texture of daily life. Moments become vivid because they are not treated as investments. Conversations deepen because they are not rehearsals for the future. Choices feel cleaner because they are not burdened with impossible expectations. Fear shrinks when expectations are released. Expectations are the scaffolding fear stands on. Without them, fear collapses into something manageable. Living without guarantees also transforms love. Love under fear is conditional. It demands reassurance. It seeks continuity. It reacts defensively to change. Love under impermanence is different. It is attentive rather than possessive. It is present rather than predictive. It does not ask how long. It asks how fully. You love without trying to freeze the other person in time. You allow them to change without interpreting it as abandonment. You remain connected without insisting on permanence. This does not make love weaker. It makes it resilient. Resilient love survives change because it is not built on denial. Grief still appears when love ends or transforms. But fear does not turn grief into collapse. You grieve because you cared, not because you believed the bond was owed to you forever. Living without guarantees also changes how you relate to effort. Under fear, effort is anxious. You work to prevent loss. You strive to secure identity. You chase outcomes to justify existence. Effort becomes heavy. When impermanence is accepted, effort lightens. You still work. You still build. You still create. But effort is no longer demanded to prove worth or secure safety. You act because expression matters. You build because engagement feels right. You contribute because participation is meaningful. Results are welcomed, not clung to. Failure no longer feels like erasure. Success no longer feels like insurance. Fear loses leverage here. It can no longer threaten you with loss of identity. Identity is no longer stored in outcomes. Living without guarantees also reframes time. You stop treating the future as a courtroom where your life will be judged. You stop living under the pressure of eventual validation. The present regains its authority. You notice where you are, what you feel, what is required now. This attentiveness stabilizes the mind. Fear thrives in imagined futures. Presence dissolves them. Without guarantees, you also stop demanding explanations from life. You do not ask, "Why did this happen to me?" You ask, "What is happening now?" This shift removes resentment. Resentment requires the belief that something unjust occurred. Impermanence removes the expectation that life must be fair in the way the mind defines fairness. This does not make suffering acceptable. It makes it intelligible. Suffering becomes part of the movement of conditions, not a personal indictment. Fear weakens because the mind stops framing experience as accusation. Another change emerges in how you face endings. Under fear, endings feel like theft. Something was taken. Something went wrong. Without guarantees, endings feel like completion. Not pleasant, not easy, but coherent. You recognize that every form was temporary from the beginning. Nothing was stolen because nothing was owned. This does not eliminate sadness. It removes shock. Shock is what fear feeds on. Living without guarantees also transforms courage. Courage under fear is forced. You push through anxiety. You override hesitation. You act while fighting yourself. Courage under impermanence is quiet. You act knowing things may not work out. You speak knowing words may be misunderstood. You open knowing closeness may end. You do not need certainty to move. This is real courage. Fear cannot compete with it, because fear depends on the promise of safety. Impermanence removes that promise. What remains is honesty. Honesty about change. Honesty about loss. Honesty about uncertainty. This honesty is grounding. It allows you to stand where you are without negotiating with the future. Living without guarantees does not remove pain from life. It removes the extra suffering created by false hope. Hope that things will remain unchanged. Hope that effort will freeze outcomes. Hope that identity can be secured. Impermanence dissolves these hopes, and in doing so, it removes fear's strongest tools. You stop living as if life must justify itself. You meet life as it arrives. This meeting is not dramatic. It is ordinary, and that is its power. Fear loses influence because life is no longer treated as a threat. It becomes a process, a movement, a participation. You do not conquer impermanence. You move with it, and in that movement, fear becomes unnecessary. After acceptance settles, a deeper question emerges. If nothing is guaranteed, how should one act? This question exposes a common misunderstanding. Many assume that without guarantees, action loses meaning. If outcomes are unstable, why commit? If results do not last, why try? This assumption mistakes attachment for motivation. Attachment says action matters only if it secures permanence. Impermanence reveals a different truth. Action matters because it is an expression of alignment, not because it freezes outcomes. When fear dominates, action becomes transactional. You act to obtain security. You move to protect identity. You decide to control the future. Every choice carries an unspoken demand. Let this last. This demand distorts effort. You hesitate until certainty appears. You postpone courage until risk disappears. You overthink decisions to avoid impermanence. Action slows. Life narrows. Impermanence does not discourage action. It strips action of false expectations. When acceptance deepens, action changes quality. You no longer act to prevent change. You act to respond to what is present. This distinction is subtle but transformative. Action without attachment does not mean indifference. It means freedom from bargaining. You stop negotiating with life through effort. You act because action is appropriate now, not because it promises stability later. This creates a steadier rhythm. You commit without desperation. You choose without panic. You engage without clinging. Fear weakens because it no longer controls the terms of action. The mind often resists this approach. It worries that without attachment, effort will decline, that discipline will fade, that ambition will dissolve. But attachment was never the source of discipline. Fear was. Fear-driven discipline is brittle. It depends on constant pressure. It collapses under uncertainty. Action rooted in clarity is resilient. It continues even when outcomes are uncertain. This is why some people remain effective under pressure while others freeze. The difference is not confidence. It is relationship to impermanence. Those who accept impermanence act without demanding certainty. Those who resist it hesitate until certainty appears. Impermanence never provides certainty. Action without attachment also changes how success and failure are experienced. Under fear, success becomes insurance. Failure becomes erasure. Under acceptance, success is welcomed. Failure is informative. Neither defines identity. This shift reduces emotional volatility. You are no longer elevated by success or crushed by failure. You remain engaged. This engagement is powerful. It allows learning without shame, adjustment without panic, persistence without obsession. Fear depends on stakes being existential. Attachment raises stakes to unbearable levels. Impermanence lowers them, not by making things unimportant, but by removing the belief that everything must secure the self. The self is no longer stored in results. This frees action from paralysis. You stop asking, "What will this guarantee?" You start asking, "What does this express?" Expression replaces protection. This is how creativity returns. Fear suppresses creativity because creativity involves uncertainty. It risks exposure. It invites impermanence. When attachment loosens, creativity flourishes. You create because creating is truthful. You speak because silence would be false. You act because inaction would be avoidance. None of this requires permanence. Action without attachment also changes how responsibility is carried. Responsibility under fear is heavy. You feel personally accountable for outcomes beyond your control. You internalize results that were shaped by countless conditions. Impermanence clarifies limits. You are responsible for intention and effort. You're not responsible for outcome. This distinction is liberating. You give fully where you can. You release what you cannot control. Fear dissolves because the mind stops taking on impossible burdens. This does not mean withdrawing from life. It means participating honestly. Impermanence teaches that outcomes are collective. They emerge from conditions, timing, and chance. When you accept this, blame and pride both soften. You stop blaming yourself for every loss. You stop inflating yourself over every success. Action becomes grounded. Another transformation occurs in decision-making. Under fear, decisions are delayed. You search for certainty that does not exist. You wait for perfect conditions. Under acceptance, decisions are timely. You assess what is known. You acknowledge what is unknown. You move anyway. This movement prevents stagnation. Fear paralyzes by demanding clarity before action. Impermanence reverses the order. Action generates clarity. You learn by doing, not by waiting. This principle applies across life. In relationships, you show up without demanding forever. In work, you contribute without demanding recognition. In growth, you practice without demanding mastery. Action becomes sincere rather than strategic. This sincerity is stabilizing. It anchors the mind in process rather than projection. Fear loses relevance when process matters more than outcome. Impermanence also reframes risk. Risk under fear feels threatening. It is something to minimize at all costs. Risk under acceptance is inevitable. It is something to meet intelligently. You no longer ask how to avoid risk entirely. You ask how to respond if risk materializes. This question is answerable. Avoidance is endless. Response is practical. Impermanence shifts focus from prevention to resilience. Resilience grows through action. Each time you act without attachment, you prove something important to the mind. You prove that uncertainty is survivable, that outcomes are not identity, that life continues without guarantees. Fear weakens because its predictions fail repeatedly. You act. Uncertainty remains. You survive. Over time, the mind learns. It stops insisting on guarantees before movement. This learning is not conceptual. It is embodied. You feel it as steadiness. Action without attachment also transforms ethics. When fear dominates, ethics are conditional. You do what is right when it feels safe. When impermanence is accepted, ethics become internal. You act in alignment even when outcomes are uncertain. You do not require reward to behave truthfully. This integrity stabilizes identity. Fear loses leverage when identity is rooted in values rather than results. Values persist through change. Outcomes do not. Impermanence reveals this hierarchy clearly. Action guided by values remains meaningful regardless of outcome. This meaning is durable, not because it lasts, but because it does not depend on lasting. You act because it is right now, not because it will be remembered later. This orientation dissolves fear of judgment. Judgment relies on permanence, memory, reputation. Impermanence undermines all of these. Action becomes lighter. You stop performing for the future. You start participating in the present. This participation is alive. Fear thrives on anticipation. Presence dissolves it. Action without attachment does not remove uncertainty from life. It removes uncertainty from the self. You no longer require the future to validate you. You validate yourself through alignment now. This alignment is calming. It reduces internal conflict. You're no longer split between desire and fear, between wanting and resisting. Action flows. Impermanence supports this flow, not by guaranteeing results, but by removing false conditions for engagement. The paradox becomes clear. When you stop acting to secure permanence, action becomes more consistent. Fear loses its grip because life no longer feels like a test you might fail. It becomes a process you participate in, and participation does not require certainty. It requires presence. Fear hides most skillfully inside love. It disguises itself as care, as loyalty, as devotion. It speaks in soft language and convinces you that its presence is proof of depth. I worry because I love. I fear losing you because you matter. I need reassurance because this bond is important. These sentences sound reasonable. They feel sincere, but beneath them lies a quiet confusion. Love is not what creates fear. Possession does. Impermanence exposes this distinction with ruthless clarity. When love is confused with possession, impermanence becomes terrifying. Every change feels like a threat. Every distance feels like abandonment. Every uncertainty feels like loss before it has even occurred. Fear turns love into a fragile structure that must be constantly protected. You monitor tone. You interpret silence. You seek confirmation. You guard against endings. Love becomes work. Not the work of presence, but the work of defense. Impermanence was never the enemy here. The enemy was the belief that love should freeze what is living. Love that demands permanence is not love for the other. It is love for stability, and stability does not exist. Impermanence reveals this by dismantling every attempt to hold. People change. Desires evolve. Needs shift. Connections transform. None of this means love was false. It means love was alive. Fear enters when the mind treats transformation as betrayal. It says, "You are not who you were. You're changing." This is not what I agreed to, but no agreement was ever signed. Impermanence does not break promises. It reveals that promises about permanence were never possible. Love without possession begins when this is seen clearly. You stop demanding that connection remain unchanged. You stop asking intimacy to guarantee continuity. You stop measuring love by duration. This does not make love weaker. It makes it honest. Honest love recognizes that presence is the only certainty. You meet the other person where they are, not where you need them to stay. Fear loosens because love is no longer asked to secure identity. This is the turning point most people resist. They fear that without possession, love will fade, that commitment will dissolve, that care will lose intensity. The opposite is true. Possession dulls love because it replaces curiosity with expectation. You stop seeing the other as they are. You see them as they should be. Impermanence disrupts this projection. When possession is released, attention returns. You listen more carefully. You notice subtle changes. You engage with the present version of the person, not a memory. Love becomes dynamic again. Fear thrives on rigidity. Love thrives on movement. Impermanence restores movement to love. This does not remove pain. Loss still hurts. Endings still wound. Absence still aches. But fear no longer turns pain into catastrophe. Grief becomes an expression of care, not evidence of failure. You grieve because something mattered, not because it was owed to you forever. This distinction transforms suffering. Without possession, grief moves. It does not harden into resentment. It does not turn into self-blame. It does not collapse into fear of loving again. Fear of loving again comes from the belief that love must end in disaster. Impermanence corrects this belief. Love ends because forms change, not because love was wrong. This understanding makes courage possible. You dare to love without guarantees, not because you believe it will last, but because it is true now. Love without possession also transforms boundaries. Under fear, boundaries are defensive. They exist to prevent loss. They are rigid and reactive. Under acceptance, boundaries are clarifying. They exist to support honesty. They allow connection without self-erasure. Impermanence supports this clarity. You no longer stay in situations out of fear of endings. You no longer cling to relationships to avoid loneliness. You choose connection freely. Freedom deepens intimacy. Fear restricts intimacy because it narrows attention to survival. Impermanence expands intimacy because it removes the demand for permanence. You stop asking, "Will you stay?" You start asking, "Are we present?" Presence replaces promise. This shift also changes how jealousy operates. Jealousy under fear is obsession with control. It monitors threats. It imagines rivals. It anticipates loss. Impermanence dissolves the fantasy that control was ever possible. You cannot own another person's attention. You cannot freeze desire. You cannot guarantee loyalty through vigilance. Accepting this is painful, but resisting it is exhausting. When impermanence is accepted, jealousy loses fuel. You still feel insecurity at times, but you no longer act on it compulsively. You recognize insecurity as fear, not truth. You respond with awareness rather than reaction. Love becomes calmer, not because risk disappears, but because you stop pretending it can be eliminated. Impermanence also reframes commitment. Commitment under fear is contractual. It depends on conditions. It demands consistency. Commitment under acceptance is intentional. You choose again and again, knowing choice is not permanent. This does not weaken commitment. It strengthens it, because each choice is conscious, not assumed. You remain because you want to, not because you are trapped. Fear binds through obligation. Acceptance binds through clarity. This clarity creates stability of a different kind. Not stability of form, but stability of values. Values endure, even as forms change. Love grounded in values can survive transformation. It adapts. It does not require sameness. Impermanence teaches love to evolve. This evolution is often mistaken for loss, but it is often growth. Fear resists growth because growth threatens familiarity. Impermanence insists on growth because stagnation is not possible. Love that refuses to grow becomes fragile. Love that allows growth becomes resilient. This resilience is quiet. It does not announce itself with certainty. It does not promise forever. It simply shows up, again and again. Love without possession also transforms how solitude is experienced. Under fear, solitude feels like abandonment. It triggers panic. It feels like proof of unworthiness. Under impermanence, solitude becomes neutral. It is a condition, not a verdict. You do not rush to fill it out of fear. You do not cling to connection to avoid it. You allow space. Space supports authenticity. Fear-driven love suffocates. Acceptance-driven love breathes. Impermanence creates room. This room allows honesty. You speak more truthfully because you are not negotiating permanence. You risk vulnerability because you are not trying to secure outcomes. Fear censors truth to protect attachment. Impermanence liberates truth by removing that attachment. Love becomes simpler. Not easier, but cleaner. Cleaner, because it is not entangled with demands it cannot fulfill. Impermanence does not destroy love. It removes the conditions that make love fearful. What remains is connection without ownership, presence without pressure, care without control. Fear cannot survive there, because fear needs something to hold. Love without possession holds nothing. It meets, it feels, it lets go, and in that movement, love remains alive. One of the deepest fears the mind carries is not the fear of loss, but the fear of meaninglessness. When impermanence is fully acknowledged, a quiet question surfaces. If nothing lasts, what is the point? This question has haunted human beings for centuries. It appears whenever certainty dissolves. It rises whenever the structures that once held meaning collapse. The mind assumes that meaning requires permanence, that value must be preserved over time to be real, that significance depends on endurance. Impermanence challenges this assumption directly, and when the assumption breaks, fear rushes in to fill the gap. Fear whispers that without permanence, effort is wasted, that love is foolish, that creation is pointless. But this whisper is not wisdom. It is habit, the habit of measuring meaning by duration rather than depth. Impermanence does not remove meaning from life. It removes a false definition of meaning. False meaning says something matters only if it can be kept, only if it can be remembered, only if it can be secured against disappearance. True meaning operates differently. True meaning exists in experience, not in storage. A moment is meaningful because it is lived, not because it is preserved. A choice is meaningful because it is made consciously, not because it lasts forever. An action is meaningful because it aligns with truth now, not because it guarantees future reward. Impermanence reveals this distinction with clarity. Fear arises when the mind insists that meaning must survive time, when it demands that value be proven through continuity. This demand is exhausting. It turns life into a project of preservation. You try to protect memories, reputations, achievements, and identities from decay. Impermanence undermines every one of these efforts, not out of cruelty, but out of honesty. Nothing was designed to carry meaning indefinitely. Meaning was designed to be lived. When this is not understood, people fall into despair. They look at the impermanent nature of existence and conclude that nothing matters. This conclusion is not logical. It is emotional. It is fear reacting to the loss of a familiar framework. Fear says, if meaning cannot be guaranteed, it must not exist. But meaning does not need guarantees. Meaning is immediate. Impermanence sharpens meaning by removing delay. You stop postponing purpose until conditions stabilize. You stop waiting for life to validate your choices. You live meaning directly. This is deeply unsettling to a mind trained to seek validation through permanence. The mind wants proof. It wants evidence that its efforts will endure. Impermanence offers none. Instead, it offers presence. Presence is uncomfortable at first. Without permanence, you cannot outsource meaning to the future. You cannot rely on legacy, recognition, or lasting impact to justify your actions. You must decide now. This decision terrifies the mind. Fear emerges not because meaning is absent, but because responsibility has returned to the present. Impermanence removes excuses. You cannot say, "It will matter later." You must ask, "Does this matter now?" This question is more demanding than it seems. It requires honesty. It requires you to feel into what aligns with your values without knowing how it will be received or remembered. Fear prefers external validation. It wants meaning to be confirmed by others, by outcomes, by time. Impermanence dissolves these confirmations, and in doing so, it invites a deeper form of meaning. Meaning rooted in integrity. Integrity does not depend on permanence. It depends on alignment. You act in alignment with what feels true, not with what promises endurance. This alignment stabilizes the self. Fear weakens because identity is no longer dependent on lasting impact. You're not defined by what remains. You're defined by how you participate. Participation is immune to impermanence. You can participate fully even when nothing lasts. This reframes ambition. Ambition under fear is driven by the desire to leave a mark, to be remembered, to justify existence through permanence. Ambition under impermanence shifts. You still strive, you still create, you still contribute. But contribution is no longer about legacy, it is about engagement. You build because building is meaningful now. You speak because silence would be false now. You care because caring is appropriate now. This immediacy removes anxiety. Fear relies on future judgment. Impermanence dissolves that courtroom. There is no final verdict waiting to define your life. There is only the ongoing process of living. This does not trivialize effort. It purifies it. You stop inflating actions with expectations they cannot fulfill. You stop demanding that life justify itself through permanence. Meaning becomes lighter, not superficial, but unburdened. Impermanence also clarifies suffering. When meaning is tied to permanence, suffering feels like proof that something has gone wrong. Pain becomes evidence of failure. Loss becomes evidence of futility. Impermanence reframes suffering. Suffering becomes part of participation, not a negation of meaning. You suffer because you are involved, because you care, because you are alive. This suffering does not invalidate meaning, it confirms it. Fear resists this idea. Fear wants meaning without vulnerability. Impermanence makes vulnerability unavoidable. This is why fear and meaning are deeply entangled. Fear attempts to protect meaning by controlling outcomes. Impermanence reveals that meaning cannot be protected that way. Meaning does not need protection. It needs honesty. Honesty about change. Honesty about limits. Honesty about uncertainty. This honesty is stabilizing. You stop oscillating between hope and despair. You no longer ask whether life will amount to something. You ask how you're showing up. Showing up becomes enough. Impermanence transforms the question from, "Will this last?" to, "Is this true?" This question is answerable. Fear hates answerable questions because they remove excuses. When you know what is true now, delay becomes unnecessary. You act. You speak. You choose. Meaning is generated through these acts. Not stored, not preserved, generated. This generation is continuous. Impermanence ensures that meaning must be renewed. This is not a flaw. It is a feature. It prevents stagnation. It keeps life responsive. Fear prefers static meaning. Meaning that can be secured, and defended. Impermanence insists on dynamic meaning, meaning that adapts, evolves, and dissolves. Dynamic meaning is harder to control, but it is more alive. This aliveness quiets fear. Fear thrives when life feels like a test with a final score. Impermanence removes the scorecard. There is no final accounting. There is only participation. This participation does not promise comfort. It offers authenticity. Authenticity steadies the mind. You no longer chase significance. You embody it. You do not need permanence to feel meaningful. You need presence, and presence is always available. Impermanence guarantees that. Every fear eventually leads to one place: death, not always consciously, not always directly, but beneath fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of change, fear of irrelevance, there is a deeper tremor. The fear that something will end and cannot be recovered. Death is the ultimate form of impermanence, and because of that, it becomes the final testing ground for everything the mind believes. Most people do not fear death itself. They fear what death represents: the end of continuity, the collapse of identity, the disappearance of control. Death terrifies the mind because it exposes the last illusion, that something was ever meant to last. Under fear, death is treated as a catastrophe, an interruption, a theft. The mind says, "This should not happen. This is unfair. This is too soon." But impermanence does not operate on fairness or timing. It operates on conditions. Life arises. Life passes. This movement does not wait for readiness. Fear intensifies when the mind insists that death should follow rules it never agreed to. The same pattern appears in smaller losses: the end of a relationship, the loss of health, the fading of youth, the disappearance of a role. Each loss carries the echo of death, and the mind reacts the same way. This should not be happening. I am not ready. This is too much. Fear is the refusal to accept finality. Impermanence reveals that finality is not an enemy. It is a boundary. Boundaries give shape to experience. Without boundaries, nothing would be distinct. Nothing would be precious. Nothing would be real. Death gives life definition. This idea is often misunderstood. People think accepting death means becoming numb or indifferent. It does not. It means seeing life clearly. Fear distorts death into annihilation. Impermanence reveals it as completion. Every form that arises completes its arc. This is not comforting in a sentimental way. It is grounding. When death is denied, fear spreads everywhere. You cling harder. You demand more. You resist change more aggressively, because every ending feels like a rehearsal for the ultimate loss. Impermanence invites a different relationship. When death is acknowledged, smaller losses lose some of their terror. You still grieve. You still feel pain. But fear no longer amplifies the experience. Grief becomes proportionate. It hurts because something mattered, not because something went wrong. Fear disappears when death is no longer treated as a personal failure. Death is not evidence that life betrayed you. It is evidence that life unfolded. The Buddha did not teach people to deny grief. He taught them to remove the extra suffering created by resistance. Grief arises naturally. Fear arises when grief is interpreted as injustice. Impermanence dissolves this interpretation. Loss does not mean you were careless. It does not mean you loved incorrectly. It does not mean you failed to protect what mattered. It means a form ended. This understanding changes how loss is carried. Without impermanence, loss feels unbearable because it feels wrong. With impermanence, loss feels heavy but coherent. Coherence matters. When experience makes sense, fear diminishes. This is why rituals around death exist across cultures. They provide structure for impermanence. They acknowledge ending without turning it into chaos. Fear thrives when endings are unacknowledged. Impermanence insists on acknowledgement. It does not allow denial. When death is integrated into awareness, life becomes less frantic. You stop racing against time. You stop hoarding experience. You stop trying to extract meaning from the future. You live more deliberately, not because you fear running out, but because you understand that moments are finite. This understanding sharpens presence. Presence is the antidote to fear. Fear lives in imagined continuations that will never occur. Presence lives in what is here. Death collapses imagination. It forces attention into reality. This is uncomfortable for the mind, but stabilizing for awareness. When death is faced honestly, many fears lose credibility. Fear says, "What if this ends?" Impermanence replies, "It will." Fear says, "What if I lose this?" Impermanence replies, "You will lose everything." This reply sounds brutal, but it is liberating, because if everything will be lost, nothing needs to be protected at all costs. You stop clinging selectively. You stop making some things sacred and others expendable. Everything becomes equally temporary. This equality is calming. It removes hierarchy of fear. No single loss can destroy you because all forms are already provisional. This does not mean you become detached from life. You become intimate with it. Intimacy without illusion. You love knowing love will end. You build knowing what you build will fall apart. You care knowing caring will lead to pain. Fear cannot compete with this honesty. Fear relies on surprise. Impermanence removes surprise, not by predicting events, but by removing false expectations. When death is accepted, fear loses its ultimate threat. It can no longer say, "This will destroy you," because you already know destruction is built into form. What remains is the question of how to live, not how long, not how safely, but how truthfully. Death clarifies priorities. It strips away trivial anxieties. Concerns that once seemed urgent lose relevance. You stop worrying about being seen a certain way. You stop postponing what matters. You stop bargaining with time. Fear weakens because time is no longer treated as a resource to be controlled. It is treated as a condition to be respected. Respecting time changes behavior. You speak more honestly. You forgive more quickly. You act with fewer rehearsals. Fear thrives on postponement. Death removes postponement. It makes now unavoidable. This immediacy does not make life intense in a frantic way. It makes it sincere. Sincerity is calming. You're no longer performing for the future. You're no longer living as if meaning will be assigned later. Meaning happens as you live. Impermanence ensures that this is the only place meaning can exist. Fear fades because it no longer has leverage. It cannot threaten with endings you already accept. It cannot intimidate with loss you already expect. It cannot paralyze with death you already face. What remains is a quiet courage, not heroism, not bravado, but steadiness. You do not need certainty to live. You do not need permanence to care. You do not need guarantees to act. Death teaches this lesson relentlessly. Impermanence completes it. When fear no longer uses death as a weapon, fear loses its final argument. Life becomes lighter, not because nothing matters, but because nothing needs to last to matter. This is where fear ends, not in denial of death, but in its acceptance. At the end of this journey, nothing dramatic needs to happen. There is no final revelation, no sudden victory over fear, no permanent state to achieve. What remains is quieter than that. A shift. Fear does not disappear because impermanence has been defeated. Fear dissolves because impermanence has been understood. This distinction matters. Throughout life, the mind searches for certainty as if certainty were safety. It collects plans, beliefs, identities, and attachments to shield itself from change. Each layer promises protection. Each layer eventually cracks. Impermanence passes through them all, not as an enemy, but as a fact. When this fact is resisted, fear multiplies. When it is accepted, Fear simplifies. It loses complexity. It loses narrative. It loses authority. Fear becomes what it always was, a signal of resistance, nothing more. The journey you have taken is not toward fearlessness, it is toward honesty. Honesty about change. Honesty about loss. Honesty about limits. This honesty is grounding. You no longer need to pretend that stability is possible. You no longer need to exhaust yourself defending identities that cannot be preserved. You no longer need to negotiate with time. Impermanence ends the negotiation, and in doing so, it returns something precious. Attention. When the mind stops bargaining with the future, attention returns to the present. Not as a technique, not as a discipline, but as a natural consequence. You notice what is here. This noticing is simple, but it is not trivial. You feel the weight of your body. You hear the texture of sound. You sense the quiet movement of thought. Life becomes immediate again. Fear struggles in immediacy. Fear prefers distance. It needs imagined futures and alternate pasts to survive. Presence starves it. Impermanence ensures presence by removing false expectations. You no longer ask, "How do I make this last?" You ask, "How do I meet this honestly?" This question changes everything. It changes how you work. You engage fully without demanding permanence from your efforts. It changes how you love. You offer care without turning it into possession. It changes how you grieve. You feel loss without turning it into injustice. It changes how you act. You move without attachment to outcome. Impermanence does not reduce life. It clarifies it. Clarity is not comfort, but it is steadiness. You stop oscillating between hope and dread. You stop inflating moments with expectations they cannot fulfill. Life becomes proportionate. What matters still matters. What ends still hurts. But nothing feels catastrophic. Catastrophe requires the belief that something essential was supposed to last. Impermanence removes that belief. This does not make you passive. It makes you responsive. Responsiveness is different from control. Control attempts to dominate what cannot be dominated. Responsiveness meets what arises and adapts. Adaptation is quiet strength. It does not announce itself. It does not seek recognition. It simply continues. This is the strength impermanence cultivates. Not the strength of certainty, but the strength of flexibility. Flexibility allows you to bend without breaking. Fear breaks when things do not go as planned. Flexibility adjusts. Over time, this adjustment becomes trust. Not trust that things will go well, but trust that you can meet what arrives. This trust is not optimism. It is resilience. Resilience grows every time you survive change without collapsing. Impermanence offers countless opportunities to practice this. Each ending teaches the same lesson. You remain, not as the same form, not as the same identity, but as awareness. Awareness is not threatened by impermanence. It witnesses impermanence. When identity shifts from form to awareness, fear loses its target. There is nothing fixed to defend. This is not detachment from life. It is intimacy without illusion. You're closer to life because you're no longer demanding that it be different. You stop asking reality to cooperate with your preferences. You meet it as it is. This meeting is the source of calm. Calm does not mean absence of emotion. It means absence of internal conflict. Emotions arise. They move. They pass. Fear only dominates when emotions are resisted. Impermanence allows emotions to complete their cycles. Completion is healing. Unfinished emotion fuels anxiety. Completed emotion restores balance. Impermanence completes everything eventually. When the mind stops interrupting this process, fear loses urgency. This is why the end of fear is not dramatic. It is quiet. You notice that you worry less. You recover faster. You cling less, not because you are trying to, but because there is less reason to. You no longer believe that safety depends on permanence. This belief was the root of fear. Without it, Fear has no foundation. Life still changes. Loss still comes. Death still waits. But these realities no longer dominate your inner life. They are acknowledged, not obsessed over. Acknowledgement is powerful. What is acknowledged does not need to shout. Fear shouts when it is ignored. It quiets when it is seen. Impermanence sees everything. It does not single you out. It does not punish. It simply moves. Moving with it is not surrender. It is alignment. Alignment feels like relief, not because circumstances improve, but because resistance ends. This is the quiet freedom impermanence offers. Freedom from arguing with reality. Freedom from demanding guarantees. Freedom from living as if something must last for life to be meaningful. Meaning does not require permanence. Meaning requires presence. Presence is always available. Impermanence guarantees that now is the only place life happens. Fear dissolves when you stop living elsewhere. This does not make you fearless. It makes you grounded. Grounded people still feel fear, but fear no longer defines them. It becomes information, not identity. You listen to it without obeying it. You respond without panic. You continue. At the end of this journey, nothing needs to be added to your life. Something needs to be released. The demand that life be stable. The expectation that safety comes from control. The belief that meaning must last to be real. Impermanence removes these burdens. What remains is lighter. Not empty, not numb. Alive. This aliveness is enough. Not because it lasts, but because it is here. And here is where fear loses its power.